Hey, it's Dr. Nate, and this is Module 2.3, Masculinity and Pop Culture. Now, this is something I like to talk about not just in the media and sexuality class, but in all the classes I teach, media and identity, also the media theory class, because masculinity is it's everywhere. It is something that we cannot escape. It affects not just the way men are portrayed and men perform their behavior, but also the way women are portrayed, right? Because masculinity, especially if we're talking about hegemonic masculinity, like we did in the last module, affects the way in which women are portrayed opposite men, and also in the presence and also in the absence of men. So it's kind of like this all patriarchal hegemony type of thing that we talk about, right? So masculinity and pop culture. There is a video, actually there's 3 videos I posted in this module for you, and the first one is a snippet from the documentary called The Mask You Live In. And this documentary looks at the way in which masculinity is reified through society, both in physical interactions but also in mediated spaces, how it's portrayed in film and television. And the documentary highlights different types of characters from different types of pop culture mediated depictions where men are portrayed as strong, rational, not emotional. Men have to be violent. Men have to be aggressive. Men can't cry. Men have to always be this persona that is very masculine and machismo. And because all of the portrayals that we see in television, in films, all the leading roles, all the characters, the superheroes are predominantly these very non-emotional, violent. They repress their feelings. They act out. They're aggressive. Because all of these are being reified in the media, then the people who are watching them, specifically young men, are going to start to think that that's how you have to be a man, and that's the only way in which you can perform masculinity. So I want you to take a look at this snippet. Like I said, I put it right here in the rest of your module videos. It's only 5 minutes, but it really gives a good job at showing a variety of different characters throughout different films and television series that reify this very hyper-masculine ethos of what it is to be a man, and then taking that representation and thinking about how we interact with it on very daily interactions, whether it might be in the news, a TV show, a film, and how that starts to influence, right, this gender performance of this patriarchal, heteronormative, very hegemonic masculine male, and then how people in turn start to police one another, right? Not just men policing other men, but also women and parents and society policing men, how they're supposed to act, and then this kind of hegemonic hyper-masculine ethos keeps being reproduced over and over in our society. And so for the purpose of this class, we're really going to be looking at how that masculinity is being portrayed in different types of spaces. And your viewing for this module is really going to look at how that hyper-masculine ethos is kind of being broken down in specifically spaces that are online, these digital streaming platforms that might have these counter narratives that counter the hegemony that we see so often. So I want you to think about what are the most attractive male celebrities that you can think of in television or film. Just right now, at the top of your head, think who is the most attractive. And if you're a man right now who is heterosexual and you're like, I'm not thinking about a celebrity that's hot, that right there is an example of hegemonic masculinity, right? Just think of who you would consider attractive, right? Because even if you're not an LGBTQ member, right, you can still look at someone and think, oh, I think everybody else thinks this person's handsome. This person might be the pinnacle of masculinity. I want to look like him. I want to dress like him. I want my body to look like him, right? There's this term called spornosexual, which kind of came up after people started looking at metrosexual, right? So metrosexual back in like the late 2000s was really about men who started to take care of themselves, men who were grooming themselves, plucking their eyebrows, using facial cleansers and creams, and taking care of their skin, moisturizing, going to the gym. They were called metrosexual. And a lot of people really took that as the counter narrative to what would be this very hyper masculine ethos. Now we look at spornosexual, and spornosexual I think is a lot more comfortable for individuals who have this hegemonic masculinity because it looks at how men look at pornography and sports figures, spornosexual, together, and try to model their bodies and the way they look after porn stars and after athletes, right? So then they want to be more masculine. Again, seeing how the media has influenced the way in which men specifically think about their bodies. And then of course, if we're always seeing these type of individual men portrayed as the most desired in media, then women too start to think this is the most desired type of masculinity out there. So, what are some of the effects and consequences of this hegemonic masculinity in pop culture? So, just thinking of those people you thought about earlier and these very masculine, most attractive males, how are they portrayed in media? What is their role? How do they act? How do they dress? How do they behave? How do they treat women? How do they treat other men, right? And then that in turn influences the way in which we as society start to come to think about what masculinity is, how men should behave, right? What is this gender performance of men? There's been lots of different research that has come out that looks at this masculinity and the positive repercussions and the negative repercussions. Most of them have been negative, really painting this one unidimensional portrait of what a man should be. And in turn, the young men who are watching them then start to model their behavior after these mediated television characters. The positive portrayals are when these characters are very intersectional, and it's not just about the traditional straight cisgender white young fit male and how they act, but all these different intersectional identities that come together to make this character or characters more robust and more intersectional, therefore being a more positive role model on young children, letting them see that there's a variety of ways in which they can be men, and there's not one solo archetype for that. There is this video that I also posted on your module, Men's Standards of Beauty Around the World. And we're just going to look at just a couple of seconds of it here because I think I want you to look at all of it on your own. But I want you to see a little bit of what makes a man attractive. And they used different types of pop culture examples from around the world and found what was depicted as the most desirable type of man in different parts around the world. So we're going to start off here with the United States and what makes a man attractive. So if you watch the whole video, which you should, by the way, I can actually go on Blackboard and see who has been watching the videos and who hasn't, and I'm going to start using that as a way to grade your responses here, but we'll talk about that later. You can see that as we go around the world, there are different types of beauty standards, right? Like in Brazil, men who get cosmetic surgery are actually considered to be in line with what their cultural template of masculinity is. However, in the United States and Mexico, that might not be it. You will also notice that there's a commonality amongst a lot of the Latin American countries in which this idea of machismo behavior is really what makes a man a man. That's what makes him most desirable, most attractive. So now we're looking at not just the way in which masculinity in men affect the way men behave, but also the way in which people who are attracted to men start to create their own sexual attraction to these individuals, thinking that these men who are more machismo, right, more in line with the cultural template of masculinity, tend to like these individuals and think they're more attractive. So I want to talk about a show right now that has a lot of Latin American characters and is modeled after a telenovela type of template, and that's Jane the Virgin. And Jane the Virgin is praised a lot for its very progressive depiction of women, specifically Latin American women. But what is left out is how they portray men in the show. And so one of the research projects that I'm working on right now is looking at the way in which the men of Jane the Virgin are still being portrayed in these very heteronormative, patriarchal, hegemonic, masculine archetypes. And so I'm going to take the first three characters that were introduced in the first couple of seasons. Now we look at, there's more characters that are involved. There's a bisexual character. There's also an older Latin American gentleman that comes in that really speaks to the patriarchy part of it. But for the purpose of this and to keep it kind of short, we're only going to look at the first three. Now this is Rafael Solano. And as you can see here, he's gorgeous, right? He's probably in line with a lot of the ideals of what we think are male beauty around the world. He's young, he's fit, he's hot, he takes care of himself, he's well groomed. And in the show, he's portrayed as this Latin lover, which is one of the stereotypes of Latino men. And so he still has all these women. He has children from two different women. He's always dating different people. He's most desirable. He uses his body, takes off his shirt in one of the seasons a lot in order to get people to do what he wants. So he's very portrayed as this Latin lover boy. The next one is Michael Cordero. And even though his parents in the show are white and he's kind of portrayed as a white character, he still embodies a lot of these Latino archetypes. Again, he is a police officer, so there's this kind of machismo tough guy. He's not the violent type per se, but he does use a lot of aggression. He does fight a lot. There's a lot of physicality in what he does in terms of his job as a police officer and how he interacts with Jane. And then, of course, him and Rafael are both vying for Jane's love and affection, which can sometimes turn a little bit violent. And then you have Rogelio de la Vega, who is this kind of, again, this Latin lover, but more specific, he is this kind of buffoon, which is another Latin masculine stereotype as well, is that there's this clown figure, right? And that is what Rogelio is. And even though he is there for comedic relief and he has a lot of scenes where he really does some funny things, he's also very vain. And he thinks about how he looks all the time. He's always concerned with his Twitter followers, always concerned with his hair, his skin, how he looks. And so again, these three individuals put together really looking at how the men are really portrayed in Jane the Virgin, giving, yes, three different ways in which men are portrayed, but to the younger viewers and people who may be not have this interaction with Latino males, again, the idea that to be a Latino male in a TV show, specifically telenovelas, you have to be beautiful, you have to be fit, and you have to have this level of masculinity, specifically sleeping around with a lot of people, to be considered a man. There's also a lot of these interactions between the two characters. As I mentioned earlier, Rafael and Michael fight a lot for Jane's affection, and in some instances actually physically fight. So there's this male aggression always happening. And then down here on the bottom, you can see Rogelio and Michael having this bromance, right? They have these handshakes, this way of talking to one another. And this is at the beginning of the season. So I know a lot of things have changed in terms of the characters on the season, but really the first four seasons set up how the women of Jane the Virgin were very matriarchal. They made a lot of independent decisions. They held themselves down, and how the men kind of were interjected into their lives as a form of disruption and a form of kind of this counterbalance of what patriarchy and hegemony is. And if you look at the last season that it's playing right now on the CW, you see a lot more of this very heteronormative Latino machismo patriarchal culture being re-embedded into Jane the Virgin, and Jane herself really struggling to kind of understand how her grandmother specifically is letting this happen to her. But you can watch Jane the Virgin for that. No spoilers here too. So again, when we think about masculinity in pop culture, a show like Jane the Virgin, which is on cable television, you can access actually the CW via their app and get all the content free if you want to watch it. But how these three different men might be shown intersectionally different in terms of their social economic status, in terms of their jobs, in terms of their age, but all three are still beautiful, young, have this machismo masculine ethos, and are still giving the impression to people that are viewing that there is still kind of this one archetype of what it means in terms of masculinity in these telenovelas, whether that telenovela is happening in Spanish in Latin American countries or in English like Jane the Virgin right here in the United States. Justin Baldoni, who plays Rafael, is far, far different from the character that he plays. And he has a TED Talk that is out that I've also placed in the module for you to watch. And he talks about how to be a good human being, and that men don't have to just embrace other men. They can actually be feminists and embrace women and listen to them. So some of the questions that he asks right here, well, first he says, your strength, your bravery, your toughness. Are you brave enough to be vulnerable? Are you strong enough to be sensitive? Are you confident enough to listen to the way women, or to listen to the women in your life, right? So he's kind of giving this redefinition of what masculinity is while still being masculine, right? So it's kind of like this paradox of sorts, right? Masculinity isn't just about being these traditional patriarchal, heteronormative, hegemonic masculine ideals, but it's also about being more sensitive and being in touch more with what we would call feminism, right? But at the same time, he's challenging you like a man would, right? And asking you to look at your strength and relating all of these typical masculine things like strength, bravery, and toughness to get you to kind of push yourself to different limits and be vulnerable, be sensitive, and be confident and listen, right? So, still in a way, he's using masculinity as a way to challenge masculinity, which I'm here for. But I want you to watch his YouTube video.